So I'd like to welcome everyone to this session. Journal editors discuss diversity, and I'll introduce the members of the panel in a minute. But I just also want to draw your attention also to the subtitle of this session. There are many different ways, of course, to talk about diversity, many different kinds of diversity, and we're focused in this discussion, because we only have an hour, to the challenges of variously racial, ethnic, and national representation in research and publishing. And I'll explain those issues a little more and the renewed attention on those last year as I proceed along. So let me advance my slides. There we go. Okay, our panel, some of whom may be in the process of connecting and arriving, going alphabetically by first name, is first of all, Chris Crandall, who, and you can see all our university affiliations on the Whova page, but I thought it was also important to show our journal affiliations for those of you who don't know. Chris Crandall has recently stepped down as the editor-in-chief of Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, PSPB. Colin Leach, currently editor-in-chief of the IRGP section of Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, also was one of the editors at PSPB most recently. David Sherman, the current co-editor-in-chief of Personality and Social Psychology Review. Denise Sikokwatiwa, the past associate editor of PSPB and Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology journals. Margot Monteith, who's currently the editor-in-chief of SPPS. Marlone Henderson, who's one of our team at the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology as an associate editor, and myself as the editor-in-chief of Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. So we have representation from many of the journals in our field that people like to publish in, the journals that also are sponsored, some of them by SPSP as an organization. And really, we want to center this discussion on two challenges that became apparent or became renewed as challenges last year. First of all, the article from Roberts et al. In Perspectives, which was focused within the field explicitly of US-based research, but pointed out that there was a lack of racial and ethnic diversity no matter how you sliced the pie, in the participants of the studies that we report as social personality psychologists, in the authors, and also in the evaluators, in the reviewers, editors, and editors in the peer review process. There were also two other papers which can be seen as the latest data collection points in actually quite a long tradition of showing that research in psychology also overrepresents, most centrally, US Americans, again, both as participants and as authors and evaluators, but also more broadly, societies where the social minority is of European origin. So countries like Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Canada, Australia, etc. And so these two big questions are: how can we make psychology publishing more inclusive, and what are some of the steps that we can take, both in terms of racial and ethnic diversity and in terms of national diversity? And so, by way of opening remarks, we want this mostly to be an interactive session, and the way you can interact as a viewer, if you're watching this live, is to put your questions in the Whova app chat window, the Q&A window in particular, which is located to the right of your screen. You can don't put questions in the Zoom chat, and we won't be looking at raised hands. We want our attention to be on one place. That one place will be the Whova Q&A. But I'm going to start by going around those of our editors of our panel who wish to have a brief remark on this question, which is just one thing, either something that exists or something that's been proposed that either stands in the way of or helps us to progress towards greater diversity in publishing. And so since we don't have a set order to do this, I guess I'll just call on people who in our discussions beforehand indicated a wish to speak. So Denise, maybe you could go ahead and deliver your proposal or question.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Roger. I'm happy to start things off, and thanks everyone for being here to join this conversation. I think that one thing that really stands in the way of diversity in publishing is this norm that seems to have developed around sample sizes and then also replication, such that researchers who are focusing on underrepresented minorities can often struggle to recruit these participants in large numbers, and thus their research is most likely to struggle to meet or to not meet the current standards for sample size and also for presenting these multi-study package papers. Just to provide an example from my own experience, several years ago, I designed an experimental lab study focused on African-American women who were majoring in engineering. And I was really trying to fill a big void in the literature on experimental lab research involving that population. And what I found was that African-American women, of course, make up less than 1% of people who are earning bachelor's degrees in engineering. So even if I was able to recruit every single Black woman who is incoming into our university to major in engineering, it was going to take me years to reach the expectations for sample sizes that are expected nowadays in the most prestigious mainstream journals in social psychology. And then I was also imagining that once I submitted it for publication, I might just be asked, by editors and reviewers to run more studies or to provide more replications. And so it really became a barrier to publishing that work, and that study never did make it to publication. So I think that these requirements that we have or standards for large samples and replications, it really can relegate research on underrepresented minority people to either non-mainstream or specialty journals, which can lessen its impact and potentially marginalize that kind of work. So we can talk about what might be done to remedy that situation. It might include, for example, having new guidelines for editors and reviewers about sort of elevating the value of this kind of excellent research that's being done that includes these hard to reach populations.
All right, thanks, Denise. Yeah, that's something we can get into. And if people have any questions or possible solutions for this, just, please drop into the Whova chat. Okay, I think we'll go next to Marlon. What's your one thing?
Hi, everyone. I would say if I was to focus more on the evaluator side of things, one of the things I've noticed as an associate editor is that when authors submit manuscripts and you get this option to suggest recommended reviewers, which I take seriously, I think we all take seriously in consideration in terms of potential reviewers. I've noticed this trend where people will nominate what I call the big wigs, like the most famous people in our field that are attached to these phenomena or topics, which, realistically, given the nature of how busy they are, they're likely doing editorial work and other things. They turn down these reviews a lot. So honestly, I don't even ask most of the time because I know. And I think that actually creates an opportunity. So in two ways. One, I think as authors, when you're submitting these manuscripts, to think outside of these kind of limited suggested folks, that's a great opportunity to suggest a more diverse pool of potential reviewers. But also for those people who are listed and then you turn down these reviews, they have, all journals have this option of suggesting then potential reviewers if you can't take on a review. And that's a great opportunity to put forward new names, new considerations, new people that we as editors have not potentially heard of or considered. I don't really see that happening as much. So either reviews are turned down and no one necessarily offers alternative reviews, or if they do, it tends to be, again, this kind of standard limited pool of people. And so as editors, not that we don't also seek out potential reviewers on our own outside of this recommendation, but as an author, you have a lot of influence there. And then these suggested reviewers who turn down reviews have a potential influence on us as well. That's a great opportunity, I think, to increase the diversity of the pool of potential evaluators, which then ultimately feeds into getting into the editorial board process and all of that stuff down the road if you get editorial review experience.
Yeah, and just to explain, if you're new to the publishing game, that sometimes when you submit an article, as you in the submission process, there'll be fields and you can fill in who are reviewers that you can suggest. And so, you can definitely use that a little more with a little more awareness to help out. Okay, Colin, I think you wanted to just go into interactive mode, right? So we'll go next to David, and
I can say something when we come to me, Roger.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, David then.
Hi, so thanks for organizing this symposium. I'm one of the two editors of PSPR, along with Professor Hee-Jung Kim. And one of the practices that I think can help promote diversity in publishing is recognizing the role of review articles in promoting diversity. And see the promotion of diversity in science in our thinking as a major function that review journals provide, and that this should be further encouraged. When I think about papers that have led to a rethinking of our field in ways that have promoted diversity and frank discussion of it, the papers that come to mind are review papers, including some of the articles that precipitated this symposium. So as Roger mentioned, Roberts and colleagues on racial inequality and psychological research that appeared in Perspectives on Psychological Science, Thalmayer and colleagues, an American psychologist, on the overrepresentation of American participants in the studies, and earlier papers like Henrik and colleagues on the weirdest people in the world that appeared in Brain and Behavioral Sciences, as well as papers that have influenced our thinking about how the impact of diverse experiences on psychological processes, such as Claude Steele on Stereotype, an American psychologist, and Marcus Nkiyama on Culture and Self and Psych Review, just to name a few. So these articles have all tremendously impacted our science and are impacting our science, represented by all here discussing some of the issues by these papers, and have represented diverse both in terms of authorship as well as perspective, both in terms of the content of what they've discovered and their commentaries on the field. And so I think they show the function that review journals play in changing the science and should play in changing the science. As an editor of a review journal, I think we could do more to recognize and encourage papers of this type. And as well as authors and advisors, we can encourage and write these types of papers, encourage our collaborators and our students to write them. So thanks. I look forward to hearing more from my fellow editors, how we can contribute to greater diversity in publishing.
Okay, and now Colin.
Thanks, Roger. For me, I think when I took over at JPSP just over a year ago, and in the 6-month process prior to that to build the team, I took the question of representation very seriously. And I think for me, it was very important to not just talk about diversity and inclusion, but for our institutions and our practices to actually enact it. And not only is this good practice and ethical practice, but it actually, representation in that form has the way of actually communicating inclusion to reviewers, to potential authors, and to whomever. So for me, it was very important to not just meet what I think is the current recent standard now of having a gender balanced team, but actually the team there's a minority of people who are based in the US on our editorial team. There are visible minorities on the team, and everyone has basically had an experience working in more than one country. There are several people who study culture and underrepresented minorities, who work on issues of assumed universalism and also practice methodological diversity and meta-theoretical diversity. So for me, it was very important for JPSP, especially given the role of the journal in the field, to actually represent an openness and inclusion and diversity in the editorial team itself. This also went all the way down to the consulting editors, who are often not sort of reimagined with each team. And for me, it was really important to bring in younger people. And in the editorial team, and also among the very long list of about 100 consulting editors, to not just have geographical diversity, but also to not have as a standard that you actually have to publish in JPSP to be an associate editor or consulting editor of JPSP. This is a guaranteed way to close the system. And so I think letting go of these presumptions and assumptions, kind of like what Marlon is saying, these habits of mind and practice that some ways make things easier, they all can open up the team in a way that actually shows to everyone involved, reviewers, potential authors, and of course, as Marlon was saying, opening up who actually is listed in the database of possible reviewers. You do that by consulting editors, but you also have each person involved go through their network and identify people who are not the most obvious people and get them into the databases that editors use to search. And this, I think, all communicates to people from outside, this journal might be interested in what I do. This journal might be, my assumptions about what this journal publishes and how they evaluate things may not be right because I see evidence to the contrary with my own eyes. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Colin. I just want to have my 2 minutes or so, and really this follows up what both Colin and Marlon were saying about these closed loops, these people you first think of that become the only people you think of. And I saw this happening, and Marco's joined us as well. But I saw this happening as, in selecting, as Colin said, editorial boards or consulting editors. And again, to explain this publishing lingo, these are the sometimes long lists of people who are treated as trusted reviewers, who have an agreement in exchange for appearing on the journal website to give X number of reviews per year at least, and to be called upon by our editors. And often, traditionally, these are just constituted off the top of your head. They say, who's up and coming, who's really good. And you might also have a more data-driven approach to this. You might look at the stats for reviews in your journal, but even that is also kind of a closed system because it's those people who are invited in the first place to review. And how do you think of people to review? Well, Marlon's already covered how that can be a closed system. So I've turned to open calls, and from my experience with open calls, they've been good experiences. We've gotten great people, but open calls don't always give you the kind of diversity you're looking for. They'll give you a kind of diversity. You will get people who you may not have thought of and who are really, really good applying. But I think from my experience, I would say those also have to be combined with some more mindful process of seeking out people and approaching them. And especially if you're looking at geographical diversity, where you may not have much of an idea of, who is doing really good work in China, let's say, and you may have to approach some people who are more knowledgeable in that field to get that information. So anyway, that's all I have to say. I'd like to give Margot, who's just joined us, the opportunity to give her 2-minute observation of a thing in diversity in publishing.
So I wanted to raise an issue related to diversity in our participants. So suppose a manuscript is entitled Moral Convictions Predict Collective Action. This title suggests that the results are relevant to all of humankind, right? The title doesn't provide a qualifier to the broad relevance of the research, but if you go to the participants section, chances are you'll find that the sample was weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, and included almost exclusively white people. So an article that Roger has brought to our attention, the Chen article, pointed out that researchers specify to whom their results apply when their samples aren't weird samples and also when their samples include minorities or people who are minoritized. For instance, their title might be Moral Convictions Predict Collective Action Among Turks, or Moral Convictions Predict Collective Action Among African Americans. However, with weird and white samples, too often titles and writing throughout the entire manuscript imply that the results are relevant to everybody. Also, if you go to the participants section of this manuscript on moral convictions predicting collective action, you might not see reference to the nation in which the research was conducted, and you may not even see a breakdown of participants' racial, ethnic, and cultural characteristics. If you do see a breakdown, chances are that the sample isn't representative. For instance, if the research was conducted on M-Turk with US citizens, the researchers probably took whoever they could get for the sample, but they could have quite easily included programming for their study that would allow for diversification, such as by closing it off to white Americans after reaching a certain sample size or n for that subgroup. So many psychologists, and especially in the US, have been trained, if not explicitly, then implicitly, to overlook sample diversity in planning our research, in conducting it, and in writing it up. And I look back on my own work, and I've done this. But I think a lot of us would agree it's time for a change that involves a shift of consciousness where we routinely consider the diversity or lack thereof of our samples. So, when the non-replication kind of crisis made us face potential threats to the credibility and validity of our research, the field was pretty fast to identify and start using best practices to address these threats. And lack of diversity in our samples also poses a threat to credibility and validity. And, I'd like to ask, shouldn't this elicit the same kind of urgency to identify and use best practices? Mm-hmm. So I have ideas about how this might be, what this might look like, but I wanted to throw it out to the audience to see what everyone thinks.
That's great, Margot. And, actually, if you read very carefully into the APA 7th edition manual, and in particular, the chapter 3, the Journal Article Reporting Standards, or JARS, their template for a title requires you not just the abstract, but actually the title to mention in general terms the source of the participants. So if you take the new APA manual literally, I'm not seeing too many people doing this in practice, but read it carefully, because it does say, according to JARS, if you're doing it on mostly white American M-Turk workers, then that should be in the title. And so that's really radical. I wasn't expecting that, but it is. If everyone did that, it would move us towards this greater awareness. Okay, that's enough that I'm going to speak. I'm still really sorry that Chris Crandall couldn't make it, but yeah, there's all sorts of things that could have interfered. So I am now going to attempt to look at the questions. I'm not seeing any questions in the sidebar. So maybe tech support can help. Maybe people just haven't asked any questions yet, but
I do not see any further than the 2 that were published earlier, and it does take a couple of minutes for the questions to populate. But if participants begin asking their questions, hopefully they will eventually populate within the agenda for journal editors.
Okay, well, I suppose.
Keith Maddox has a question, Roger.
Okay, yeah, sure. We can do it the old-fashioned way, and Keith can speak up on voice if he's on voice.
I'm working on it, guys. Hold on one second.
Okay.
So I think I'm running into a little bit of trouble technically. I signed into the meeting using the Whova app, and I actually don't have any option to submit through the chat. So I think I can turn on my video, but it's not working for me right now. When I hover over my video icon, it's Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening there, but I'm not able to actually type in a question, but I do have a question in case you want to work on that in parallel.
Yeah,
And
let's do that. Let's just override this technical difficulty.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I can't get my video to work, but thank you everyone for your comments so far. And I think one of the challenges that that I've been thinking about. So I am a person of color, and I've been approached about getting involved in doing a little bit more in terms of editing, particularly in some of the lead editor sort of positions. But one of the challenges that I've had is, and I think that other people, when I've spoken to a lot of other people, when they say when they get into it, when they first get into it, there's a little of a trial by fire kind of experience that they find that depending on who the sort of the editor is, that might be sort of the lead editor for the journal. And if you're coming in, let's say, as an associate editor, that there's not a lot there's a lot of variation in terms of the kinds of organizational structures that people will have in terms of really just getting started, right? So giving people some tips about how to move forward, how to go about doing things, whether or not there's sort of any regular meetings amongst the editorial board, or conversations or discussions, or even some elements of sort of continuing education, just to make sure that people are on the same page about new developments in terms of research methodologies, analytical techniques, things like that. It sounds like a lot to do, but I guess one of the questions I had is whether you had some thoughts about sort of the onboarding process for new editors, and whether or not there's a way to make people feel a little bit more comfortable that when they're getting into it, that there's a process that they're going to learn and develop over time, as opposed to jumping into what could potentially be sort of a kind of a messy and disorganized situation.
Wow, that's a great question. Would anyone of us like to answer it? Just unmute and speak.
I was just going to jump in just for a sec, but to say that I agree with Keith about when you first start out, and how it, he called it a trial by fire or something, but it is like when you first try it out, it is a lot of a learning process, and it takes a lot longer than you think until you kind of figure things out. And so when I started at CDEMP, I remember doing it because it, relative to other journals, it had a bit of a lower load. I considered it a way to kind of, what they call put your toe in the water, try it out. And so that was, that's kind of how I learned by starting there. But I could see really the value of some kind of a mentor or something, or somebody who could be there to answer questions for you, like, I don't understand how you address this problem, or even interfacing with the journal website. And I could see a process like that being really useful for people who are just starting and are putting in an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how to do this well.
Can I also respond? Keith, we can see you now, by the way.
Yeah, I found the button.
Well, good to see you.
You too.
I love this question, because I mean, what I said at the beginning, I stand by, but what I was also going to say, if I have more time, is very much related to this. I actually think your comments, what you're asking goes beyond just even the stage of joining as the editorial board, or like, as an associate or an editor. I would even back it up to getting involved as a reviewer. Like, I go back to like my experience of I first got it, like, well, even what I do with my students now, right? Like, a manuscript comes along and it's like, okay, I think this might be relevant to my students' interests, and I hope they've got the time. And then there's some kind of, mentorship that I give them with it, but it's probably not the greatest because I'm usually rushed to finish that. And so, and I wish we had, like, I'm not necessarily faulting like our field, but like all these organizations, SPSP, APA, it would be great if we had some kind of trainee programs that specifically were designed towards our graduate students, and teaching them how to review manuscripts, and also all the way up to what you're talking about through like editorial, like all those kind of things where there's like a formal process. Because I think if you had it formalized or some kind of system, it would also feed back to the bigger question of this symposium about, you would have ways to ensure that it wasn't just this like, well, who do I know and who comes to mind kind of process, but there's something that would ensure that we have this diversity and representation, or of what we hope. And so I love this comment and question. I've been, I would say I'm fortunate, like my experience with JESP and Roger has been really good. Roger's good about organizing meetings, and it also helped that I was friends with some of the associate editors, but that's just luck, right? It shouldn't depend on like luck or having a, really good, editor. It should be kind of like taken for granted that no matter where it happens, like you're going to get this kind of good experience. So I wish we had something more formalized through not just a single journal, but I would think like the field, like our organizations that kind of provided this kind of mentorship experience or training experience.
Roger, Margot, you were unmuted before, so I don't know if you were going to say something about this, so go ahead if you are.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I think this would be fabulous if we had something as a field. At SPP, I provide a document that has a lot of tips and information, and then I'm just really available to people who come on board, and let them know that I'm available, and they can email me or we can Zoom or whatever. But yeah, it would be fabulous to have more work in this area as a field.
Yeah, or just to standardize it, because I've had both kinds of experiences, and I definitely learned. I said I want my associate editors. We like Margot. I have a tips document. Often confer when they find turn up tricky cases. But yeah, that's not something that always happens. So maybe, yeah, we should standardize this more. So just to move on here, and thank you again, Keith. Just to move on.
Yeah, sorry, I was just had my hand up for ages. Sorry. I just want to mention that there is actually an early career mentoring lunch tomorrow on this that I'm actually doing around reviewing and publishing for early career scholars. So the conference is actually trying to address this, and I think that's one route that we could probably have a lot more on. I just want to mention that. And I also want to mention that I think Keith's point is very important, because this is another way where the field gives people jobs that they presume they already know how to do. And this has been done to us, all of us, right? So you teach before you've been trained to teach, you review before you've been trained to review. But this is very important, because this is a practice that looks fair or neutral on the surface, but actually reinforces inequality, because who knows already how to do the things they haven't been taught how to do? They have people who had advantage access. So I think the only way we can address this is to institutionalize not just training about reviewing, but editors have to also be chosen on the basis of taking training and seriously in terms of their editorial teams. Otherwise, they default to choosing the people who already know how to do the job. And so for me, again, this was a very important part of our initiative, that I made sure that we had an in-person training at the last SPSP in New Orleans. Of course, there was some COVID risk involved that we didn't know about at that time, but I thought it was really important to have an all-day in-person session for the whole team to coordinate and to calibrate, to share resources like the JARS document that Roger mentioned, the publication manual, and to actually talk about the process, to share actual information and statistics on rejection rates, reviewing, and the process. And so I think editors have to commit to doing this. Otherwise, again, we create a closed system that perpetuates unequal access.
Thank you, guys.
Roger, we have about 5 questions in Kuva, and hopefully we can get through those in about 20 minutes. So kind of keep your comments brief.
Okay.
And go ahead, Roger.
Okay, so let's see. Let me try to get to Whova and the sidebar. I'm in the Q&A, but I'm still not seeing more than the 2 basic questions, unfortunately.
Roger, there's an audience member, Frank, who's had his hand up for a little while.
Okay, why don't we go to Frank? Nick, could you? I don't know about how to deal with these questions in Whova that I'm not seeing.
Okay, I will read them off. We'll go to
okay. Frank. We'll take Frank, and then we'll take some of the questions. All right, Frank, go ahead. Frank Cafisi.
I am not seeing a microphone from frank. So let me
Okay.
go with the question. So from Debbie, we have, what advice do you have for us that might help recruit a more diverse group of authors, considering the many are students and junior faculty?
Okay. Just think about that. And would anyone like to address the question?
If I could just give you a little background, because it is the Psychi Journal, we're generally getting new students. We're generally, they're younger graduate students, but we really want to be reaching out to these students that feel nervous about publication, feel like there's barriers. We want to start breaking those down. And any advice that you have that you can help us, we would greatly take.
Okay, I think most of us caught that. There was some crackling on the line, but yeah, the question is about how do you encourage especially junior people and I guess from these groups we were talking about to submit in the first place and to publish. So I don't know if anyone has experience or some answers about that.
I could say something about that, but also say, Roger, if you refresh the Whova page, that's when the new questions show up.
Oh, you got to refresh.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I think that one answer to this is, you've got to meet people where they are. And so I am not a Twitter social media person, even though I study it. But to actually try to increase access and information, I've started tweeting about the contents of the journal and the team. And I think there's a way to actually to be tweeting and to get into the networks. So this is a social network problem. And I think there are targeted networks of younger people or underrepresented minorities or people who study culture or difference or what have you. And getting into those networks and especially finding important or influential people in those networks that spread information about journals and invitations is really, really important. General calls are often not enough. We've got to actually get into the networks where people are and find people who are trusted in those networks to spread information when we're so socially segregated and polarized or divided. We've got to actually get into the more local networks.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, David, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to follow up, a lot of editors do outreach at different universities and different speak to different about the kind of run workshops. So I've been asked and have done it. And I know lots of other editors have as well. So we consider that to be part of our mission is working for a journal. So I would consider inviting to speak to groups about the process, as well as other people who've served in different roles in the editorial process to speak and kind of what it's like from the inside. One other thing is SPSP does have this free forum Friday, and those are open meetings. And my fellow editor of PSPR and I appeared at Free Forum Friday, and other editors can or could be invited to do that. And anyone can come to those Free Forum Fridays, and they're just open discussions about the process and kind of open Q&A and way to get more information about different roles in the editorial process.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we can move on. I can now see the Whova questions. So yeah, Rodolfo Mendoza Denton has a question. Do we need wholesale change in our process? Which is a briefly phrased but profound question. I think we probably do, but for a whole bunch of reasons, not just for diversity reasons. But I think, and you talk to everyone, they are proposing a different kind of wholesale change to address this issue or that issue. But the one thing you have to keep in mind is to keep that all these things are interconnected. And if you change the process to be more progressive in terms of openness and transparency, of methods, of reporting, et cetera, you also need to make sure that that change does not take you backwards in terms of diversity, in terms of representation and inclusion. So that's just a very general answer to a somewhat general question, but if people have other things to add, I would welcome them.
Well, this is Denise. I think I would just hope that maybe we don't need to revamp everything, but simply tweak things, like make changes that may be fairly easy to implement, but that can have broad effect. And so it'd be just a matter of figuring out what those are. But yeah, I just, I'm not sure that there's that the whole system is completely, needs a rehaul, but probably parts of it could certainly be improved upon.
Okay. Any other questions? And Chris Crandall has now joined us.
Roger, there's a couple different questions about the burden placed on underrepresented members of the field for reviewing. I don't know if you see those.
That's right. Yeah, Gordon Hudson, maybe Hodson, is asking, as editor, I want diversity in reviewers, but also aware that this increases burden on those groups at a cost of their own research. And this is also seen at university level service. So how do we balance, or how do people balance? Yeah, answers to that are welcome.
This is Margot. I mean, I think one thing that we do first off is get folks on our editorial boards. We don't have to call on them a ton, but to give some experience and to give to be able to give feedback, to provide a learning process that get people on the editorial boards, and especially so that they're getting credit. It looks good to be on an editorial board. So that's one first step. And then at the, at the associate editor or co-editor level, I think that I think there is a huge burden. There's a big press on editors to make sure, to make sure that you have diversity. For SPPS, we make sure that we have diversity across, Europe and across the United States and in Canada, and so there's diversity of location of editors and their cultures, but there's also, diversity in terms of racial and ethnic background that one wants to, support, and yet not onboard people before they're ready to be onboarded. So I think this goes back to the whole, providing experiences, giving feedback, and giving opportunity, and all the while trying not to really overburden. But that's a huge challenge. It's a great question.
Chris.
I'm right there with Margot, and also with Colin's comments, and that building the editorial board and the associate editors is a terrific way to do this, in part because you onboard their networks as well. But as Margot pointed out, the kind of diversity that you have to get in your editorial team is vast, right? You need gender, sexual minorities, you need regions, and racial, ethnic, religious group, immigrant status. And let's not forget that you have to cover topics, which makes it really very difficult. And so no one will ever satisfactorily get there, but you have to strive and try all the time, I think. And at PSPB, whatever success we had often came with needing to meet people where they are and make accommodations. As we talked about earlier, a lot of racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic, sexual minorities are oversubscribed for service, right, in their institutions and in editorials. And so sometimes you have to create an opportunity that they can succeed. And that might mean a lower paper load, a deferred start, or a window where they won't receive papers, and something like that. But the lead editors have to be flexible if they're going to be successful in recruiting, maintaining, and having successful, often younger editors.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's making me think that I'm probably not going to be editor in chief past this year, but as we go into the next iteration, when we're going out to recruit people, to emphasize that flexibility in the invitation letter, to say, you can be on this part-time, you can do it for 1 year just as a taster. Some people already did that we wanted to keep, and they said, I can only do it for a year. Let me try. And I said, okay, I want you on for that year, and we'll worry about replacing you later. So that's a great point. I think it's always this paradox that's in my mind, that it's a position of great power, right? And people's careers are really built on these publications. But at the same time, it's also a position where you give up your own research. And that's happened to me, I'm sure to everyone who's had an editor job to some extent, in order to evaluate and help to guide other people's research. And you need to balance. And I think as far as service goes, this is one of the best balances in as opposed to just doing something in the university. Doing something field wide can be huge in terms of your impact and the positive change you can make by shaping and evaluating manuscripts. But I'm always conscious of the fact that it is also a burden. And I keep that duality in mind. It's a prize, but it's a very heavy prize to carry around.
Can I just add that I understand why people are concerned about disproportionate service and burden language, but I have to say that burden language makes me a bit uncomfortable, and especially from the reviewer point of view. So I don't think serving as a reviewer in our field is service or it's a burden. It's actually participation in science. And so everyone who's actually trying to be involved in the science should be reviewing. That's there. It's a cooperative system. Now, of course, people can be overused, and that's a different question. But serving as a reviewer, especially earlier in your career, is also telling you something about what journals look for, what are editors' standards, what do other people who work in your area think about when they're evaluating papers. This is essential knowledge for participating in the science. And so I think we can take the burden service thing a little too far. And this is for all the more reason in my mind where we have to be inclusive about who reviews and who makes the decisions. Otherwise, the people who are least advantaged are judged and never judges, are outside of the process rather than inside of the process. And so I'm hesitant about how far we can go with this burden language. For me, this is participation in the science, especially reviewing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Colin. Actually, one thing I was going to say which I think nicely will echo what Colin just said, is that, when I think about this question of, is it burdensome to be asked, and I get the intent behind the question, or the concern behind the question. But when I ask my students, for example, if I get asked to review a paper, and sometimes I will say, do you want to co-review this with me? They get so excited, jump at the opportunity, right? It's such a learning opportunity for them. And I think about that actually as a potential way to help this issue. If we feel like the pool of people of whatever type, all the ways Chris talked about, if you are you're running out of people to think about, or when you're trying to hit these metrics or these criteria, I think an early place to start is some journals. I've noticed there's a lot of variability. They ask you, did you co-review this with someone? And it asks you who the person was. And then he may even ask you for demographic information. But then some journals don't. It's just okay, here's the submitted journal. I wish that was, first of all, kind of standard. Second, I wish there's a way for beyond the, like me as the person who asked my student to co-review this with me, I wish there was a way for journalists to give feedback to those. Well, hell, it'd be nice for me as a reviewer, but certainly for those new reviewers that are students, because I think it gets back to like Colin's point too about like, that's so exciting and rewarding to see that the field takes your feedback seriously, that you've shaped this, like it increases that identification also with it. So I think it would be a way to get more numbers early on, increase identification from people who maybe don't necessarily feel or question whether or not this is like a good fit for them in terms of like, you know, their identity in this field. So that's just my kind of, one of my thoughts in reaction to that. But I absolutely agree. I don't necessarily see it as a burden. And yeah, the idea of like, you know, being over asked can happen, but like just the experience of it itself, I don't agree with that as well. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Of course, that is one more thing potentially for the editor to do, who's already, so it's very brave as an associate editor yourself to say this. But I think the person to give that feedback, maybe if you are being invited like by a senior colleague or by your PhD advisor, maybe to do a review, then definitely there should be some feedback on that end, and you should be privy to the final decision and to the other reviewers' comments, which I think are often the most valuable form of feedback to see if what you said is taken up by the editor and if it generally resonates with the other people who are asked to review. So, okay, I'm gonna move on. There's a question from Mariola in the chat. What is better, studying one consistent sample like white, non-religious Americans or religious Polish citizens, and then replicating them, or more diverse samples like people of mixed nations or religious background, and thinking about general social psychology topics like moral judgment when researchers are not interested in studying the role of religion or nationality or politics. And it's interesting that you mention moral psychology, because Kurt Gray and his colleagues have recently released a paper arguing that we shouldn't be studying moral psychology so much devoid of these group relevant or background culture relevant concerns. But often we do attempt to make those generalizations. It's a really valid point. Can we really generalize when we're talking about a corpus that is based on such a narrow base? So I know some of us have had things to say about this, but this is a really pointed way to phrase the question. Which would you, I know which one is usual, the first one, but what are the benefits of just taking a much broader approach?
Well, this is Margot. I mean, the benefits are tremendous. You know, we're not just learning about one particular group if we're taking a broader approach. I think the question is really interesting. You know, do you limit it to a certain group so that, you know, you can at least say for this group this happens, or do you have kind of a, a more diverse sample, but not enough of any one group or certain groups to be able to look at it systematically? Personally, I would argue for get that diverse sample, you know, because at least that's going to go into, that variability is going to show up in your analyses. At least when you talk about this phenomenon, you know, as human beings do this or that, you know, it will have greater generalizability. Of course, having sufficient sample sizes of many different groups is the best, is the best way to do it. But we often can't do that, at least initially in our research. So when we're starting out, you know, I would argue for get as much diversity in your sample as possible.
Yeah, that's well taken. I'm thinking of initiatives like the Psychological Science Accelerator, for example, which is a project to get data collection on a single question at once, but running the study at many different sites, and with a conscious effort to make those sites international and multicultural in nature, and in such numbers that you can conduct those cultural comparisons as well. So I really think that that kind of initiative is to be applauded. We need to do more of this. If you've read some of my writings, you'll know I always think about what's the incentive to do these. And I think one disincentive is we have a very individual focused reward structure. And if you're part of a collaboration, your tenure advisor or your PhD advisor may turn to you and say, what are you going to get out of this? You'll be just one name among 50 in this collaborative effort. It's better to get something that's branded with you on it. And they wouldn't be wrong in the current system, but maybe we need to affirm and lean on acknowledging participation in these efforts more. And to do that consciously rather than just letting these people go in and then realizing, well, people are not going to take this contribution seriously. So by all means, I encourage folks to do that, because I think that tackles directly a lot of these problems that have been brought up. But we also maybe, as a field, maybe organizations like SPSP need to have a prize for collaborative efforts. And they need to incentivize joining and leading collaborative efforts. So that's my bit. Chris.
I like that, Roger. One of the things that the Psychological Science Accelerator does is brings people into the research groups who are not participating at some of the highest levels. They're often at campuses with fewer resources, greater teaching demands, and so on. And so what's happening, I think one of the benefits of that approach is that a lot of people who are participating are people who wouldn't otherwise participate. And so the downsides of participating in Accelerator are comparatively modest.
2 minutes, Roger.
Okay. Let's see if we have one more question to close out.
I think I haven't seen any new ones, so could I add something to this, Roger? Good way to look. I also just think, picking up on what you said about these large-scale approaches and then tying it to what Margot said. So I think obviously there's lots of large-scale, even trying to get representative sample survey data, which is much more possible now than it was. But I also think, given Margot's point, there's also a way where I think we could all do a lot better with much more intentional sampling. So we may not be able to get a representative sample or a fully diverse sample, but there are questions where it's clear that there's some group of people who are where the phenomenon is most likely to operate, and some group of people where it's probably least likely to operate. And by this perspective, I'm informed by Maguire's meta theory of perspectivism, that it's actually not that hard to think about who is this most likely true for and who is this most likely not true for. And many times we have access to those people if we make a little effort. And we don't have to have a representative sample of the country that we're working in, what have you. But for example, the obvious examples here are very religious and not religious, or believers and non-believers, or even the effort, the lack of effort we make to get truly conservative people in samples. And there's ways to do spotlight analyses and what have you. So I think this question is actually not as hard as it appears if we become much more intentional about what sort of people are most likely to confirm, which is going to give us greater power, and also what sort of people are most likely to disconfirm. And that just takes a little bit of thinking, and Maguire gives us some really good guides for that. And it's actually not that much extra effort.
All right, thank you, Colin. Well, on that note, I think our time is up. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and everyone who's attended and contributed. I'm really glad that this session, compared to other SPSPs, has much more global reach, as I can see already from comments from people who would not normally have been able to attend SPSP in the USA for either economic or legal reasons. And that also this is being recorded, and people are much more used to accessing events in this format, so that even if you couldn't make it, if you're on the other side of the globe and it's 3 a.m. for you, you can still access the recording of this. So thank you again, and let's keep this conversation going, okay? Bye now.